I, I was in Toronto the other day, and I mean, if anyone walks underneath the Gardner, and
You
just looks
shouldn't, by
up,
the way. Wear a hard hat if you do.
yeah, that's right. I mean, that infrastructure is eroding. It's horrible. I mean, a side
Literally.
note here, I came back from China not too long ago, and the infrastructure there is incredible. And when we talk about highways, when we talk about public transit, this is, people-centered infrastructure that, that benefits labor, that benefits the working class. This infrastructure that Carney talks about, and the rest of the Canadian ruling class talks about, is not that, right?
There's a lot of resistance stirring up for Bill 5. What did they call this? This is we were just talking about before we were recording that I think they've gotten less Orwellian with the names. Like we're at least told straight out with some of these titles exactly what they are, but this is the Free Trade and Labor Mobility in Canada Act. Okay, that's a little bit vague, but it includes the Building Canada Act. And
Actually, Jessa, I should say this is the name of this bill is quite ridiculous because it puts two bills together. So it's
it
an
does.
act to enact the free trade, etc. That first part of the bill and the Building Canada Act. Anyway, not that relevant, but it's a stupid name. But yeah.
Yeah, so it hits at that one of his biggest promises and that got a lot of traction because I think few people understood what it meant when he would eliminate interprovincial trade barriers. Red tape is another name that has given it to it, but that red tape is obviously more encompassing than provincial trade barriers. This is going to give the government the ability to bypass environmental assessments, to pay very little attention to First Nation consultations. Basically, anything they deem a national interest, red flag, is kind of free and clear. A minister can give it the green light when another project maybe wouldn't have. And they've been really explicit. He's talking about pipelines, ports. They include ports and whatever. I don't think anybody needs to ram through a port, like last minute, but we're talking about pipelines. And again, like he made it clear that this was going to be his priority. And at the same time, you've got provinces enacting very similar acts. In fact, First Nations folks, 9 different First Nations have launched a legal battle against Ontario's Bill 5, and Canada's Bill C5. And they passed almost around the same time. It was very hard to keep up with them. I thought I was mixing them up, and then I realized, no, these are almost two identical bills that completely spit in the face of Indigenous sovereignty, amongst other things.
No, that's right. So, this part of Bill C5 that you're talking about, by, sort of centralizing power in the cabinet to bypass environmental regulations and Indigenous self-determination or Indigenous sovereignty, that is part of the second part of the bill, which is, about building Canada. It's called the Building Canada Act, okay? And like you're saying, Jessa, um, you know, there have been comparable um, bills across the province. So that's why I'm saying, across the provinces, including Ontario, like you mentioned, BC as well has seems to have a similar kind of bill. I mean, this is sort of like a coordinated effort. Maybe I wanted to contextualize this a bit. Since it's so coordinated, it's worth sort of peering back and sort of investigating where that comes from. It also, thoughts are getting a little scattered here, but it's also very much related to, what I was saying earlier about how this is sort of a moment of paradigm shift, right? All these governments are looking to centralize power, erode sort of democratic mechanisms of, checks and balances, accountability, environmental assessments, indigenous sovereignty. Um, and I think the root cause of this paradigm shift really is the paradigm shift coming with the Trump administration, right? The tariff regime that Trump was bringing forward. Um, and this reaction on the part of, I might be going on for a bit here, Jess, I'm sorry, but the reaction on the part of the Canadian federal government, but Canadian governments more broadly, is really a move to do two things that, in my understanding, right? To one, protect and bolster Canadian capital, right? Because it's Canadian capital or capital based in Canada that's threatened by these tariffs, right? And two, to capitulate as well to the U.S., right? I mean, and by capitulating, you also protect Canadian capital. Um, Whereas the working classes, right? The working class and indigenous nations, they're not even sort of in the equation. They can, they can get screwed. Um, but really, I mean, we mentioned that this bill has two parts, right? This bill C5. The first part is um, getting rid of interprovincial trade barriers, encouraging greater labor mobility across provinces in Canada. That's the first part, and the second part we talked about quite a bit. Overriding environmental regulations and Indigenous sovereignty. I mean, you can see these two things coming together in the same bill basically as a way to as an attempt to find new frontiers by capital to extract profit, right? If you're getting pushed on one side by the US, if you're getting squeezed on one side, well, what do you have to do? You have to open things up. You have to rejig things so that so that you can continue to extract, to exploit, reap profits. If not in the same way as before, even greater. And so, the frontiers here are the environment, indigenous sovereignty, self-determination, right? We can talk about the Arctic as well. Energy projects really seem to be at the center here. We'll talk about it a little more. Maybe one last thing I wanted to add on this was that when we talk about, Bill C5 in particular, trying to centralize power in the cabinet to approve projects deemed in the national interest. They're talking about the cabinet, right? But how, it's really worth zooming in here. That's right? It's just one person. I mean, it's really worth zooming in here to see how cabinet has functioned, especially throughout the Trudeau era, even before that, especially through the Trudeau era, and let's see if that changes. But things seem to suggest, right, when cabinet makes a decision, this is really coming from the top down, from the PMO. A lot of power has been centralized in the Prime Minister's office, and it's the Prime Minister, his chief of staff, a couple of other policymakers and staffers, really a room of five-ish, that can essentially deem this in the national interest and thus deem it in the interest of cabinet for cabinet to then sort of give the green light here. What happened to democracy, right? I mean,
I mean, it's
we
not
talk about
like
China and Russia being authoritarian states. I mean, what's going on here?
well, and it's not like it's nefarious of the liberals either. That's by design. That's how cabinet's been designed in our Canadian parliament. Harper, we were famous on calling Harper a dictator because it was always known that like every single policy that came from that government just came from the PMO's office. And a lot of people don't know that. A lot of people, if you look at it on paper, it does look like it's a team meeting. I know we know backbenchers get no say, but sometimes the same is true of cabinet ministers. Not all cabinet ministers. Some of them clearly get input. Freeland is always in the mix, making critical decisions, but otherwise, yeah, it's very concentrated, and now it's concentrated in the hands of a banker that has a long history of ties to the US and its military industrial complex and the UK and some of the horrible reforms that went on there that benefited the most wealthy. So I watching people celebrate, yeah, the banker coming in as if that wasn't a red flag in itself was something else. But I wanted to go back to something you said and the way you're helping to explain folks why these different frontiers are opening. But I feel like you framed it almost from like it's this economic necessity that I know you don't agree with, but just hear me out for a second. Perhaps all these threats of tariffs, although Trump has many, many reasons to behave this way that we could analyze, perhaps one of them is to allow these governments to make their own paradigm shifts, right? Like, because it was immediately as soon as the tariffs were suggested, BCNDP was one of the first to act. And they're like, okay, we're going to start pushing through pipelines that we previously were in negotiations with Indigenous people around and this and that. And I'm sorry, we've just got to greenlight them right now. But when we looked at them more deeply, they involved US investors. They involved a north to south pipeline that could only go to Alaska. And so it definitely wasn't kind of a insular thing. They were selling it as such, as a protection against Trump and his tariffs, but reality, it was facilitating US capital. So I think like Carney is not so much worried about these tariffs or Ford as they are looking at them, even if it is a threat to the economy and they have to scramble as such. I think they see this as opportunities to do things they've always wanted to do. Not like, just in case a listener thinks like, oh, well, they have to take from somewhere. What are we going to do? And it's like, well, this is just this kind of green light that they've been given because we consolidated around that too, right? The nationalism that we all bought up. When I say we, I don't mean me. Okay, but or I don't mean Ashwin either. But just generally, the Canadian public in that election was like Canada first, Canada first. And like that's always so dangerous because it leads to people rationalizing, well, if it's in the national interest and I hate Trump and I'm scared of China and Russia, then I'm sorry, Indigenous nations, you're just going to have to get along or not, right? So it's it sounds a bit conspiracy theory-esque, but I often think that that's why we can't explain tariffs, Trump's tariffs, the way they go back and forth and they're used as leverage when they're already capitulating to him. Everything, right? When we talk about Bill C-2, that's another capitulation to Trump. So,
Maybe
yeah,
before we go get to Bill C2, just I maybe just wanted to build a little bit on what you're saying about you know, whether this is an economic necessity. And in the absolute sense, it's not an economic necessity. There are other ways to organize an economy, in in reaction to these Trump tariffs, right? In a more people-centered way that benefits the working class and works toward decolonization, ecological sustainability, et cetera, et cetera. I guess what I was trying to say or was that it's an economic necessity for capital. This is, the capital wants to, as you're saying, they've had these plans. This is an opportunity. If they want to continue, not just making the same amount of profits, right? But like I said,
more
more. It's more and more. It's crossing new
insatiable.
frontiers. That's right. It's crossing new frontiers. This is sort of what they have to do, what they want to do. Um, the other thing I'll say on that about, you know, an economy geared toward capital and the capitalists versus an economy geared toward the people, the working classes, and the dispossessed, um, is, a lot of this language is about, we want to fast track infrastructure projects. We want to fast track, um, they talk about energy, but they talk about this more broadly as infrastructure projects. And I think it's worth highlighting here, as listeners might know, but um, that when they talk about infrastructure, they're not talking about people-centered infrastructure. I was in Toronto the other day, and I mean, if anyone walks underneath the Gardner, and
You
just looks
shouldn't, by
up.
the way. Wear a hard hat if you do.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that infrastructure is eroding. It's horrible. I mean, a side
Literally.
note here, I came back from China not too long ago, and the infrastructure there is incredible. And when we talk about highways, when we talk about public transit, this is, people-centered infrastructure that, that benefits labor, that benefits the working class. This infrastructure that Carney talks about and the rest of the Canadian ruling class talks about is not that, right? It's particularly energy infrastructure, oil and gas, right? Fossil fuel energy, which notably, right, has high profit margins, right? So there's an incentive to keep to keep going at it with old energy, resisting transition to new energy because the profits are there. So when we talk about, pipelines, when we talk about, you mentioned ports, Jessa, ports are also important because I was looking up, in preparation for this, some of these proposed projects or, projects that are, maybe on the table that some companies have in mind that either have been proposed before or, are, still in the works. A lot of these ports are, in the north, in the Arctic. Well, at least one in particular is in the Arctic North in Nunavut. They want to, continue to develop the port of Churchill in Manitoba, and these are not just ports for port's sake. These are ports to, quote, get product to market, right? This is how, they want to extract more fossil fuel, produce energy out of it, and then, find new markets and expand abroad, continue to reap profit. So bottom line here is, when they talk about infrastructure, it's not people-centered infrastructure. I mean, in this country, I could go on, but we need high-speed rail, we need public transit. There are, way too many cars. In the meantime, it might be nice to even just have, more electric cars, than gas guzzling cars. We can't even do that. But anyway, but that's people-centered infrastructure. This is not that.
No, and just to drive your point home, the bill coming out of BC from the NDP, so that was a victory for progressives over there. Keep in mind, back in May, they passed the Infrastructure Projects Act. So they're pretty clear, and they don't. This is energy driven resource extraction. That's exactly what they're talking about, and it gives ultimate authority, like you said, to a cabinet minister, and they have to use different language. Here we have coming out of the provinces, it's not national interest, it's provincially significant project. So once somebody thinks it's provincially significant, and always, they mean the economy. They don't mean the people in the province. Because, like Carney told you this in the throne speech over and over again, right? His number one, the underlying priority was a strong Canadian economy. And we know a strong economy never means more for the working class. Our economy is predicated on, centralizing wealth and power over and over again, increasingly. So BC went ahead and passed that. They were almost one of the first ones to pass it. And immediately it sent ripples through the environmentalist groups and First Nations that had been in negotiations with them, that had been trying to work with this BC NDP. And very strong statements came out against it, obviously. I'm not sure if there's any legal work going on. I imagine there is. And, they don't want to be outdone by the Liberals, the federal Liberals either. It was a back-to-back bill. It was 14 and 15. They both do almost the same thing as Bill 5 does, and Ontario, again, yeah, they have their own Bill 5, and it's all about removing barriers to development. And Grassy Narrows and other First Nations here in Ontario, they've been protesting out on Queen's Park since this bill was brought to second reading, at least. It's going to be such a blowback for First Nations groups, but also environmentalists. Like, one of the laws that it essentially does away with is the Endangered Species Act. And I know, like, maybe you're thinking, oh, some really rare bird I've never heard of might not make it. You may not understand the depth of that, what that act does for environmentalists. They're able to protect huge swaths of land by proving it will be a detriment to just one species. So it's proven as quite an effective tool to beat back development where capital is just knocking on the door. And that's just gone and done. People can't believe it. That legislation's been around for so long. It's like almost one of those, like the Health Act. You just assume it's always going to be there. Nobody would ever do away with something like that. And, that just gives credit to Ashwin's theory there. Like this is all part of a massive paradigm shift. Do we have a name for it? You had labels for the other ones, and I was thinking, do I want to know the
I don't
name
know.
for this one?
Yeah,
Let's
we
hope
don't
it's
we
the
don't want
death
to know.
throes of capitalism.
Let's hope. I mean, that would be up to us. Yeah.
Yeah, we have to name it first, right?
Yeah, no,
Or
I
they're
was gonna
gonna
say
give
that
it.
would be the death throes of capitalism. That's up to the left to act on and to push.
I
That's what I meant.
understand.
Yeah.
Well, it's not sustainable though either. Not
Yeah,
that we can just sit back and wait it for it to crash and burn, but this isn't a sustainable way to
it's
do
not.
anything. And they know it, but it's all like live for the now, stockpile your wealth, and those considerations. I mean, our politicians are notoriously bad of thinking long term, very short term vision. But shall we move to Bill 2?
Let's do it.
Oh, I wanted to add one. Sorry. Before we
Sure.
move on to Bill 2, there's one challenge that I read when I was reading about the First Nations challenging both of those bills and the idea of national interest. And although they're making like constitutional challenges, like this is a threat to like very specific rights, they're also challenging the idea that national interest doesn't include Indigenous self-determination, right? Because it's very an arbitrary thing to say in someone's interest, in the in the nation's interest. Like we aren't a homogenous group. What's good for one might not be good for the other. What's good for the economy definitely doesn't mean it's good for me. What's good for settlers is might not be good for indigenous people. So how we define that national interest should include, X, Y, and Z, amongst other things like the protection of the environment should be in national interest. Is it? Probably not when they're defining these projects, right? So they want to ensure that First Nation self-determination is part of that discussion on what is in the best national interest. And I would argue that they're right? As stewards of the land for so long, but also if you were just talking about political stability, this isn't the way. But I'm not here for political stability. So that's, you piss off more people, we've got more ready with nothing to lose. I get that, but I just thought that was an interesting way to then challenge that national interest or provincially significant. Are you going to say it out loud that definitely does not include Indigenous rights? Be prepared to say that out loud then, because that's essentially what they're doing. So